you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Sierra. It is my honor and pleasure on behalf of our President and CEO, Andy Basic, our board, and the staff here at the History Center to welcome you all to this program today. We are so thrilled to share this program with you and to hear from our esteemed panelists and speakers today. I believe that at one point, a great Chinese philosopher once said, "Study the past if you would define the future." That is so much a part of our mission, understanding our past so we can analyze the present and make good decisions in the future, and so much a part of what we'll talk about today. Representation and people's stories are central to everything we do at the History Center. And we've had a long partnership with the Asian community through programs such as our Asian Heritage Festival, through exhibitions and collections in places like our Special Collections Gallery, our Sports Museum, where we tell the story of visionary and iconic surgeon, Dr. Freddie Fu, a section that we've just enhanced with even more materials. Our American Democracy exhibit, where we actually shared collections that date to the 1870s, where we looked at Chinese laborers who worked at the Beaver Cutlery Factory in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And even today, coming up in our Women's History exhibit that will open in March, where we'll be honored to share some materials from panelists today that are becoming part of our collection. Many of these exhibits feature celebrations and heritage and stories, but there's so much more we can do to support community efforts. We were honored to work with Marion Lean and members of the OCA to see that Chinatown finally recognized with a historic marker, a long overdue and much important piece of community history that deserved to have that public recognition. So thank you, Marion, for allowing us to participate in a small way in that important effort. Recently, members of the community have generously contributed artifacts and archives that preserve and interpret the many ways Chinese Americans have contributed to the social, culture, and economic life of this region. We are honored to present these important pieces of the past and to share those stories in everything we do, be it programs, exhibits, publications, and social media, to ensure that people remember the past and understand this history. Today, it's my honor to introduce Marion Lean, who has been a teacher, a mentor, and a leader for all of us here at the History Center and for this community. For over 20 years, Marion Lean's interest to create a more socially just society has led her down a professional path, creating safer environments for patients in rural healthcare, teaching equity and diversity in higher education, and developing more sustainable communities. A 1.5 gender from Taiwan, Marion straddles the two worlds of Chinese Eastern and American Western ways. She grew up in Southern California in a household where 4 Asian languages, as well as Asian, could be heard at any one time. Striving to understand how people's lives can be enhanced through public and governmental systems, Marion has served on the Greater Pittsburgh's YMCA Committee for Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Centers of Excellence, as a commissioner for the City of Pittsburgh's Commission for Human Relations, and on the Mayor's Steering Committee on Welcoming Immigrants to Pittsburgh. Current board trustee for the Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium. She's serving her second term as commissioner of the Pennsylvania Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian and Pacific American Affairs. She continues her 3rd year as the board president for the OCA Advocates for Asian and Pacific Americans Pittsburgh chapter. And I hope she'll tell us about the upcoming 50th anniversary of that organization, which we hope to partner in recognizing and celebrating. She also has a day job. I don't know how she fits all this into her life, but currently she directs the Education on Equity, Inclusion, and Global Awareness at St. Edmund's Academy, an independent school in Squirrel Hill, working to integrate racial, social, and environmental justice into the school curriculum so that our youngest community members are empowered to go out and tackle the global issues that matter most. Marion holds a master's in public policy and management from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and it is my great honor to have her kick off our program today. Marion Lean.
Thank you, Anne. That was so generous an introduction. I'm a little embarrassed right now, so. Good afternoon. My goodness, it is so amazing to see such a room full of you. It reminds me of the day over a year ago when we were all celebrating the completion, right, of the landmark official acknowledgement, and it was such a cold, wet day. I think they threw me up on stage a couple of times and someone said, you look like a drowned rat. So I think it's auspicious. It's raining once again, and here we are talking about something so important. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I want to thank Anne and Sierra and the good folks at the Heinz History Center for gathering us today to hear something that is so near and dear to my heart, and I suspect for you. Anne asked me today, in addition to telling you about the OCA, the work of OCA and the 50th anniversary that is coming up next year and celebration, if I'd share with you maybe some of the experiences on the subject of Pittsburgh's original Chinatown and what we did in our small part in the landmark acknowledgement. So I'm going to keep it short because I know that the stars that you come to see are just sitting right in front, and I want them to come up here. These are a panel of experts, and you really will be enlightened by what they have to share with us today. So 5 OCA boards ago, this was a group of individuals made mostly of immigrant residents that were interested in making sure that the original Pittsburgh Chinatown was recognized, right? You know, you've walked about our city, in fact, our Commonwealth, and you've seen these bronze landmarks, right? Announcing what historically has happened here and what's the significance. And that board decided, you know, it's important that we have this recognized. It's important that we share with everyone here in Pittsburgh now and forevermore that we were here. It took 14 years. It was an odyssey of 14 years, 12 years of writing the application again, and then again, and then again, and then finally accepted on the 4th time. So I want to thank the Preservation Commission. I think Leslie's here, and I think that the Executive Director, I don't know if Andy Masich is here, but they were instrumental in finally helping us get this over the finish line. But you know, I wanted to share with you a couple of the remarks for the applications that were denied. We do not think you have listed enough important, influential historical peoples. You have not shown how Pittsburgh's Chinatown neighborhood was significant beyond the broader history of this city. You know, you can just go ahead and order this bronze plaque yourself because you're going to have to pay for it anyway. You just can't put on the governor's insignia. You won't be listed in the Harrisburg books. Oh, by the way, we won't be able to officially recognize you. And oh, you can't have it right by the roadside. And here's my favorite though. There's already a Chinatown in Pennsylvania. It's called Philadelphia's. I think that one burned. So, you know, that day, you know, so I had shared with you that the day when we finally was able to unveil that bronze landmark, it was a cold day. I think that the temperature had been dipped into the 40s at one point, and it was so wet. But that was a day that I became a Pittsburgher. I'll tell you why. Even though that cold, that wet, hundreds of you came out to support. And it shared with me something. You know, oftentimes, you know, in the last 2 years, I was asked again and again, why do you want to do this? It's a volunteer job. my own family's asked me, why are you spending so much time on this? Right? And I want to share with you why. They mattered. We matter. It matters. And it doesn't just matter for those of us who look like this. It matters to everyone who calls this place home. And you know, they were trailblazers, those who came before us. And in fact, I met one just now, Charles, who was one of the original founders of OCA. OCA stands for Organization of Chinese Americans. And we are a Pittsburgh chapter, one of 100 affiliations across this country. And, we stand on their shoulders, and that's why there was Dr. Fu, who's a dear friend. We are teachers, we are artists, like Lena. We are musicians, we are, financiers. We are so many different contributors to this community called Pittsburgh, and we're influencers too. So when we make known, our past, that's when it becomes clear our future. And so I can't be more excited to hear our esteemed panelists today. I'm not going to say any more other than to do what I'm so pleased to be able to do today, which is to introduce to you Lena Chen. So Lena is originally from the California area, as I am, so very excited at that point. Her short documentary is what we're going to be seeing today. The last mayor of Chinatown, Pittsburgh, Chinatown. Lena is a Chinese American artist, writer, and scholar. She has performed and exhibited internationally, receiving the Mozilla Foundation's 2022 Creative Media Award and Best Emerging Talent at the 2019 B3 Biennial of the Moving Image. She is also co-founder of Jaded, the largest AAPI artistic and cultural platform in Western Pennsylvania. She earned a BA in sociology from Harvard University and an MFA from Carnegie Mellon School of Art. She's currently pursuing a PhD in performance studies at UC Berkeley, where her research examines how the figure of the Asian American woman reveals the anxieties and fragilities of white masculinity. So without further ado, let's bring them all up here.
Hi, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with all of you and to see so many familiar faces, so many people who have been part of my journey in Pittsburgh and part of our desire to tell this incredibly important story about Pittsburgh's Chinatown. So I want to start by sharing just a little bit about myself. I'm a California native who was born in San Francisco and grew up in Los Angeles as the daughter of Chinese immigrants. And I spent most of my life in an ethnic enclave called the San Gabriel Valley, where many of my friends were other first generation Asian American kids, and where we grew up, with parents who imparted cultural traditions and values. And I have to admit, I didn't feel super out of place growing up in a region like that. I left the San Gabriel Valley when I was 18. And since then, I've lived in Boston, I lived in Berlin, Germany, and then I came here to Pittsburgh to do my MFA at the Carnegie Mellon School of Art. And I experienced what it was like to, finally be a minority, to be in places where I wasn't seeing and interacting with other Asian people all the time. But I definitely did not think that Pittsburgh and the Rust Belt would be the place where I, in my 30s, would begin to reconnect and reclaim my roots as a Chinese American. But there were a long series of coincidences that led me to working on this documentary project with Shirley Yi, the daughter of the last mayor of Chinatown. And this was a process that began, really organically, really naturally, almost as if I was, led to do this work by my ancestors or some, spiritual guide. I found myself in graduate school in the middle of a pandemic, and I was living in Point Breeze at the time, and I was taking walks at Homewood Cemetery because there's only so much you could do. And I found myself passing through this really old section of the cemetery with gravestones that had Chinese names engraved in them. And I began to be really curious about it. I did some research and Googling, and I realized that there were many migrant workers coming from Taishan and Kaiping, the same regions where my ancestors are from, who immigrated from China and made their way to the States. And some of them made their way to Pittsburgh. And they were buried in Homewood, the folks whose bones and remains could not be returned and reunited with their ancestors in China. And that research led me to come to the Heinz History Center, to looking at the archives on the history of the Chinese in Western Pennsylvania. And that was when I first met Sierra and some of the other archivists and historians who work here. And then I found Shirley, very coincidentally, just by Googling the last name Yi, which was the name that appeared on so many of the gravestones here. And when I found her father's obituary, I discovered that he had, a daughter who was living in Mount Lebanon. And I reached out to the only Shirley Yi I could find through her faculty page at CMU. And she was so warm that we talked for an hour on the phone the first time we communicated. And she invited me into her home in Mount Lebanon, which is where I discovered this vast archive she had inherited from her father, pieces of which are over there by the window in those display cases, and which appear in the film and will be part of the story that we're sharing with you today. So without further ado, I'm so happy to present to you the last mayor of Chinatown.
What we know today as Downtown Pittsburgh was once the home to a thriving Chinese community. Springing up in the late 1800s, Chinatown consisted of Water Street, Grant Street, Ross Street, and 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ave. The area was populated by Chinese laborers, most of them men who came from the Taishan County of Canton Province. They found jobs as merchants, laundrymen, restaurant owners, and factory workers. 2nd Avenue was known as the Chinese Wall Street because of the money that immigrant workers sent back to China. Fraternal organizations like the Ong Leong and Hip Sing Tongs supported the newcomers as they made their home in Chinatown. They introduced them to potential employers, settled disputes between them, and protected them from discrimination. On Sundays, the tired old bachelors converged in Chinatown. For laundrymen, Sundays were a day of relief from boiling soapy cauldrons of dirty clothes and lifting gas-fired 6-pound irons. The central gathering point was the Chinese grocery store, Kongyitong, at 520 3rd Avenue. The store was stocked with Chinese goods ranging from groceries to laundry and restaurant supplies. Workers without permanent addresses also received their mail there. Prominent Tong officials and common laundrymen all gathered at Kongyitong to drink tea, discuss current events, and play friendly games of mahjong. My father, Toy Yi, arrived in Pittsburgh from China in 1919. He was able to immigrate despite the Chinese Exclusion Act because he had secured a visa as a merchant. In the 1920s, the newly constructed Boulevard of the Allies displaced many residents to other neighborhoods and nearby towns. My mother and I arrived from Canton in 1930. I was the eldest of my siblings and the only one to be born in China. Chinatown was then comprised of 16 businesses in mixed-use buildings with shops downstairs and living spaces for the shopkeeper and lodgers upstairs. My father rented 529 2nd Avenue. It once housed a Chinese restaurant that had gone bankrupt, like so many businesses lost to the Great Depression. There were 2 storefronts on the first floor, with completely empty second and third floors. As a tax-delinquent property owned by the city, it became home to our family, the last Chinese family to settle in an already dwindling Chinatown. My father Toy was an experienced cook who had honed his skills by catering banquets in Canton. In Pittsburgh, he found work as a cook at Tong. Upstairs, a dozen elder Chinese bachelors lived in dormitory-style quarters. Each day, they came down to a dinner prepared by my father. During the Depression, the number of tables expanded to accommodate visitors from outside Chinatown. No one was ever turned away for lack of funds. Chinese residents never received city aid because the community took care of its own people. Cooking at the Tong kept my father busy for 5 days a week. But in 1933, he decided to start an additional venture to cater to laundrymen on Sundays. For $3 a month, he rented the basement of Sung Win Ching, a former Chinese grocery store at 523 2nd Avenue. On Sunday mornings, he posted handwritten menus on a wall listing 3 kinds of congis, tripe, hog maw, or pork innards for 35 cents a bowl. He also offered a variety of dim sum. As the business grew, he added dishes like lean pork, fillet of fish, and congee with 1,000-year egg. Diners also ordered the beef chalfun, made with mother's homemade rice noodles. Father was a waiter, cook, cashier, and dishwasher. Since my mother was caring for my newborn sister, I bussed the tables as a 9-year-old. We opened at 11 a.m. and by mid-afternoon, we sold out of food. The tiny eatery started with no name, but by word of mouth, it became known as Toy's Place. I graduated from Connolly Vocational High School in 1943 and Fifth Avenue High School in 1944. After enrolling at the University of Pittsburgh, I left to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps, where I was honorably discharged in 1946. Now a citizen, I was able to return to China to get married in 1947. The following year, my wife Betty and I welcomed our first child. By then, I had been apprenticing with the Onlyon Merchants Association as the assistant to the secretary, Billy Yacht, who was Chinatown's unofficial mayor. The Onlyon Merchants Association's majestic headquarters stood at 522 3rd Avenue, next door to Tong. It was constructed in 1922 with a tall pagoda-style roof and lead windows. On the 3rd floor, visitors walked through gilded archways into a room furnished with teakwood imperial-style chairs and matching tea tables. There were carved tables embellished with mother-of-pearl and silk-embroidered hangings. A huge antique bronze incense holder stood in front of a carved altar. Long tables were set for meetings of the Onlyon officials. All community disputes were amicably settled in this ornate chamber where the aroma of sandalwood wafted through the air. In 1946, the Tong, the general store, was reopened as the Chinatown Inn. I worked there from 1948 until 1951. That year, my father and I bought out a restaurant at 124 6th Avenue and renamed it the Young Toy Restaurant, which meant American Luck. My mother directed the kitchen, where she made filling for egg rolls and dumplings. Featuring both a Chinese and American menu, Young Toy was open from 11 a.m. to 1 a.m., 7 days a week, including holidays. The restaurant was like our second home. Every family member worked all day, though I took a couple hours off to care for my young children, Lois and John. In 1954, we had a big birthday party for my father. Later that year, Betty gave birth to our youngest daughter, Shirley. In 1961, the unofficial mayor of Chinatown, Billy Yacht, passed away. He was my role model and mentor, who translated between city officials and residents who only spoke Chinese. I inherited his role as a new secretary of the Onlyo Merchants Association, becoming the official spokesman and honorary mayor of Chinatown. Every Chinese Lunar New Year, journalists interviewed me about the holiday foods and traditions. I even appeared as a guest on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to share a Chinese cooking demonstration. As mayor, my most important duty was caring for 15 elderly residents, former laundrymen who spoke little English and lived in the Onlyo Merchants Association, which had been converted into a charity retirement home in 1967. Despite diminishing membership and revenues, Onlyo remained committed to serving its community. But by the 1980s, older members passed away and new Chinese immigrants came speaking different dialects. Many were college educated, some came for work opportunities, and others created their businesses. They settled in other neighborhoods far from what was left of Chinatown. I retired, and a spokesman was no longer needed to represent Chinatown. In 1990, the Onlyo Association building was officially sold to the Su Lim Yi family, owners of the Chinatown Inn restaurant. Today, the restaurant and its buildings remain as the last vestige of a once vibrant cultural community established more than 100 years ago.
Dear Dad, you would be so proud to see how the Chinese community in Pittsburgh has evolved. I feel lucky to be the daughter of Yuan Yi, the last mayor of Chinatown. Growing up, I saw how much you loved the city and how you wanted others to learn about the history and contributions of the Chinese people. You supported Chinese residents with English translation, business referrals, and bookkeeping for their restaurants. You helped friends with immigration issues, you mentored new immigrants, you cared for aging ones, and even ran for city council. Today, more than ever, the spirit of your legacy is flourishing. Asian American Pacific Islanders in Pittsburgh celebrate kinship and support each other after tragedy. We gather for cultural festivals, we organize brunches, and we throw parties. Today, there are more than a dozen Chinese restaurants in Squirrel Hill, a neighborhood filled with Asian businesses and residents. In 2022, a Pennsylvania historical marker was erected at the old site of Chinatown. And on the day of its unveiling, I led a walking tour through 2nd and 3rd Avenue. A crowd of 100 people came out in the rain to learn about this little-known history. And I used your map as a guide to share memories from when you lived there in the 1930s. I've kept all your photos and artifacts. I have boxes of stories that you wrote by hand after your stroke, when you taught yourself to write again. I'm slowly editing your words, which you hoped would help your grandchildren understand your life. And someday, I will fulfill your dream of publishing them as a book. Thank you for serving as mayor of Pittsburgh's Chinatown, for representing and supporting the community. Thank you for taking the time to document these histories so they're not forgotten. And most of all, thank you for being my Baba. Your daughter, Shirley.
Thank you, everyone. So I want to preface this by saying that I'm an artist, but not an experienced filmmaker. And it was an honor that I had a chance to work on this project, which I really considered to be my first film project, and to do it with someone, with Shirley Yu, who gave me so much insight, not just into her own family's history, but into my family's history, into my ancestors' own experiences of coming to a foreign land, of learning how to survive, and becoming part of a society that did not always appreciate their presence and often reacted quite violently to it. So working with such a vast collection of materials that was passed down by Shirley's father was a huge challenge. We had to really struggle to decide what gets said in the film and what doesn't get said. And as you saw, there were literally boxes of text that her father had written in the aftermath of a stroke that actually paralyzed him completely on the right side of his body. So he learned how to write with his left hand. And it's that text that makes up, this voiceover that you heard. That's really the direct words coming from Yuan Yi so many years later. And there was a lot of material which we could not include, right? We had to decide what was important enough and the type of, work that we wanted to make. And that's just taught me a lot about storytelling, about filmmaking, about making art. And I think I want to devote my remarks today a little bit to the things that didn't get said in the project you just saw. So when I was doing my research, one of the things I stumbled across was a dissertation from the 1980s by a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh, Tian Shengwu. And he wrote a little bit about the experiences of discrimination that the Chinese experienced in Pittsburgh, particularly among earlier migrants. And one of the things that was very common, not just in Pittsburgh, but in other areas in the country, is that oftentimes Chinese workers, were viewed as competition with white laborers. They often couldn't do the same jobs, or, if they did, for example, with gold mining, they were taxed at higher rates. So there was a lot of unequal treatment in terms of work. And as a kind of response to that, often Chinese became laundrymen, they became restaurateurs. They took on other jobs that wouldn't place them in direct competition with white laborers. But this labor was also absolutely essential. Without the work that the Chinese were going to do, other industries would not be able to function. And yet the Chinese could not join labor organizations. Children experienced bullying and assaults in school. Just like with anti-Black discrimination, segregationist policies meant that the Chinese could be, forbidden from, getting services in a restaurant or using public pools, or barbers could refuse to cut their hair. And so this type of discrimination was far ranging and probably most prominent in things like housing, which is something that a lot of Chinese really struggled with. The film doesn't address any of these instances of discrimination or violence directly, which is not to say that this film is an apolitical project, right? And in my work as a community organizer, as the founder of Jaded, and as someone who has done quite a bit of organizing around sex work in Pittsburgh as well, I've learned that liberation doesn't just come from reiterating the need for mourning, reiterating stories of grief and of trauma, and talking in moments of tragedy or suffering. You know, liberation also comes from acts of commemoration and celebration. And this is also inherently political, right? To commemorate, to celebrate, to make works like this one, to have a historical marker erected after many, many, many years of advocacy. It means to insist on one's right to self-determination and to not merely survive, but thrive in spite of being treated as lesser than, as second-class citizens. And this is a type of second-class citizenship that for a long time in my life, I could not even imagine it. And yet, we've seen hate and xenophobia rise in recent years. We saw this happen in Pittsburgh with the Tree of Life shooting 5 years ago, which caused so much pain that continues to reverberate not just through the city, but also beyond it. We saw this with former President Trump's rhetoric that blamed Asians for COVID-19 and blamed China for interfering with the elections. And these are actions that have directly encouraged harassment and abuse and killing of some of our community's most vulnerable people, including the elderly. And we see this today in Palestine. For me, it's impossible to speak here today about this history of my people's struggle and perseverance without acknowledging the situation in Gaza and the struggle of the Palestinian people who've been second-class citizens, who've been treated like an inferior racial group, who've been systematically deprived of their rights, who are subject to dispossession of their land, their property, forced evictions, who are subject to violence. And so I need to acknowledge that right now, as I'm speaking in this moment, there are Palestinians being killed, including their most vulnerable. And that over 800 families have been wiped from the civil registry in Gaza, meaning there are no remaining living members who can tell stories of their histories, like the history of Chinatown that we are able to share today, because we have people here who can share those histories. For me, the fight for Asian liberation means the fight for the liberation of all who suffer under systems of white supremacy and of imperialism, systems that create more victims than victors. It pits people against each other for limited resources. And histories of anti-Asian violence are entangled with anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia and racism of all forms. So as I mentioned, there is so much that is not directly said in this film. But this film was made during a moment of Asian hate, during a moment of deep grief and mourning in the Asian community. And this is fortunately also a grief that led to mobilization, that led to community building, that led to coalition building, not just within different Asian ethnic groups, but with other racial groups, with other movements for liberation in this country. And I was so inspired to see a huge resurgence of interest in the story and the historical presence of the Chinese here in Pittsburgh. I didn't know coming here to Pittsburgh that this is where I would feel such a sense of pride in my identity, but that was only possible because there are people like Marion and other people working with the Organization of Chinese Americans who really advocated to have a physical marker marking a site that so many had forgotten was related to these histories. It was only possible because, a similar marker was erected in Beaver Falls, where many Chinese went to work, where I first met Jackie Wu, who's speaking later today on this panel. And this was a moment where it was possible for me and a group of my close friends here to co-found this organization, Jaded, which has since hosted events that has filled huge venues with as many people as there are here today in the Hines, and which demonstrated to us there are so many Asian people in this region who want to know more about what those who preceded us did here. And not just Asians who care about this history, but Pittsburghers of all backgrounds. So this was a moment when I met Shirley, when I came across this archive, when it felt like people were ready to receive this story. And in retrospect, all these things that seemed like coincidences at the time were not coincidences at all. This was a story that connected me back to my own family's history. And I'm so glad that my ancestors led me down this path, and so grateful that so many people here today are eager to understand this history. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Shirley Gee, who arrived here as a child immigrant during the Depression year. Arriving here as a child immigrant during the Depression years, Shirley's father, Yuan Yi, later became a leader for the Chinese community of Pittsburgh and the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. He served the community through the mid-1980s by supporting newcomers with bilingual translation, immigration matters, caregiving for elders, business advising, and public outreach with the local media. Shirley has archived artifacts of her father's life and compiled his handwritten memoirs that tell the triumphs and tribulations of early Chinese settlers in a once vibrant urban Pittsburgh neighborhood. Shirley currently teaches visual interaction design at CMU. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hello. In the later years of his life, my father began to write stories to leave behind to his 3 grandchildren. He recalled childhood memories, his Army service in World War II, and people he met in his 40-year career in the restaurant business. Some stories are stark, unembellished, always hopeful, genuine, and almost every story includes detailed descriptions of Chinese food. He passed away at age 84 in 2008, and today I honor his memory by sharing with you excerpts of some of his handwritten stories. Each of these stories connect to a decade from the 1930s through the 1980s. As I speak, you will see images that reflect my father's life over the years. This is a story about a little-known feature in a familiar Chinatown building. As a young boy, I spent a lot of time at Kwong Yutong. During the early 1930s, I heard numerous stories from the elderly men who had lived upstairs of the Chinatown shops, who had gathered in the back rooms to pass the time away. Stories were told by one venerable gentleman, a recovering opium addict, whose opium-induced euphoric dreams described tales of many real or imaginary peoples and places. I would listen to his ghost stories way past my bedtime hour of 11 p.m. Fearing the ghosts that might be harboring in the dark, I was often too scared to go home via my usual shortcut. This shortcut was a secret passageway, known only to the local Chinese and not to outsiders. The narrow hallway straddled the Ong Leong building from 3rd to 2nd Avenue. My father explicitly warned me not to dally after playing on 3rd, which was on Ong Leong territory, and for me to go straight home before dark, which was Hip Sing territory. He said that assailants might hide in the darkened hallway of the passageway. I did fear the ghosts. The hallway was never lit to save electricity and to discourage unwanted traffic. About 1/3 of the way through the passageway from the 3rd Avenue entrance, a door opened to a flight of stairs leading to an alcove landing. There, a peephole door guarded by a watchman led to another flight of stairs down to the basement. Only the regulars, the legitimate gamblers, which included the lonely laundrymen who played on Sundays, were permitted to walk down to the gambling tables for games of Fan Tan, and Pagao. Their games of chance might bring them good fortune in the Kim Sun, the land of the Golden Mountain. He had a different upbringing than his American-born siblings. As the oldest boy and the only one from China, as a teenager, Jan had to learn how to support himself and his family. Dates have a special meaning in a young person's life, whether a birthday, one's graduation, or a milestone memorable event. June 1939 was especially eventful for me. Shortly after my grade school graduation at the age of 14, my father dispatched me to go live with and to go work for his friend who operated a Chinese laundry at 73 Robert Street in the heart of the Hill District. Monday to Friday, I lived there as an apprentice and returned to my home in Chinatown on weekends. Jin Django, as I usually called him, occupied a narrow triangular storefront with just enough room for machinery and for two persons to live and work. The front part of the store was a completely enclosed waiting area with an opening only 10 inches wide by 11 inches high, just enough to retrieve one's laundry or conversely, push a bag of soiled laundry through. The dimensions of the opening prevented anyone from squeezing through if no one was present. Also, the front door was rigged up so that when a customer entered, a bell would sound. The sole laundryman working in the back room would know when a customer entered. Two ironing tables side by side were arranged facing the street and close to the wide storefront window to capture the maximum daylight illumination, thus saving on the electric light bill. A low-legged 3-burner gas stove sat near the ironing tables to heat up the 8-pound irons. Nearby was a heavy cast iron, hand-operated gas-fired press. A wall of shelves held the bundles of finished laundry that waited to be picked up by the customers. A single bed covered with a thin crumpled mattress was thrust against the wall to conserve space. This closet-sized cubicle was where Agong lived and worked. As my eyes surveyed what was to be my new home for the foreseeable future, I realized that my journey to adulthood was just beginning and that the comforts that I had previously enjoyed as a child were now gone. My father's almost entire career was in the restaurant business. Our Young Toy restaurant was auspiciously located at the center of a busy downtown block. With both the Chinese and American menu, we did a landslide business. My number 5 uncle, my father's brother Jimmy, came from Washington, D.C. to help us with American-style cooking. I still remember one lunch customer who every day ordered American dishes from our American menu, no Chinese food ever. My sister Ruth was the waitress in charge of the dining room. My mother directed the kitchen and was kept busy cooking the filling for the egg rolls. Her filling recipe was a sumptuous mix of minced pork, shrimp, and shredded cabbage. One time, a shrewd customer asked if he could order the filling alone without the crispy egg roll skin for half the price. In the 1950s, 6th Avenue was the heart of the theater district. 3 movie theaters were located across the street from our restaurant: the Fulton, J.P. Harris, and the Lowell Penn in the next block. In the evening, when the theaters let out the moviegoers, the whole street was covered with people enjoying the nightlife. With the blazing marquees and flashing neon lights, the area was like a mini Broadway. Next door to Young Toy was a nightclub called the Hollywood Show Bar. In our kitchen, a sliding door opened to their kitchen, which was not open to serve food. Their revenues were generated from serving liquor. At intermission or the change of shows, the entertainers grabbed snacks from our kitchen. Once a month, the club featured male entertainers dressed as showgirls in skimpy outfits. My eyes lit up when these showgirls came to the counter to order something to eat. Their falsetto voices and feminine gaits both surprised and impressed me. Sometimes their height and deep voices betrayed their feminine costumes, big hair, and high heels. Our young toy restaurant was just a few blocks from our home in Chinatown. In some ways, the bustling Sixth Avenue neighborhood seemed like it was light years away in a different world. After my father's death and the closing of Young Toy in 1958, I received a telephone call from Tong Yi. He offered me a job to return to the Chinatown Inn to work as the maitre d'. There, my restaurant career flourished for 3 decades more, a rewarding vocation surrounded by Chinese food. My father compiled scrapbooks that included photos and mementos of many memorable visitors to Chinatown. In 1962, I asked Harry Allbacker to perform at our Chinatown Inn Christmas party. He was remarkable as he could wear 2 hats on a single day, working as a printer 9 to 5, but after hours, he was an entertainer, a magician. He performed at fundraising charities, private parties, and other social events. Dressed in a billowing, colorful costume from head to toe, Harry wowed the kids and grown-ups alike. One trick after another, he delighted the audience with his magic. For the climax of the show, he pulled a live rabbit out of a hat. At the conclusion of the show, he offered the rabbit to my kids. Naming the rabbit Lucky, we took him home. Overnight, Lucky slept near the radiator in the living room, but his time with us was brief, not very lucky at all, short-lived, and he was dead the next morning. A popular entertainer was Pearl Bailey, the talented African-American performer. She was unaccompanied when she sauntered into the inn one evening. She was well-dressed, but not overly pretentious. Some diners recognized her immediately, and she obligingly signed autographs. Miss Bailey ordered 2 dishes and said that whatever she didn't finish, she would take back to the hotel to enjoy as a snack later. One dish was sweet and sour pork, and the other dish was shrimp fried rice. Not ashamed of her humble roots, she talked about her childhood and how she enjoyed her grandmother's traditional pig's feet stew with black-eyed peas. I was captivated by her charm and down-to-earth conversation with me. Year after year, the business grew. Several Pittsburgh Pirates baseball players were frequent diners, including Roberto Clemente, who visited often at the restaurant and signed many menus for Aunt Helen, who was a gracious restaurant hostess. A distinguished visitor came to Chinatown in 1988. Barbara Bush, wife of George H.W. Bush, was invited by the Young Chinese Republicans Club of Pittsburgh. The campaign event was held in the spacious, ornate meeting room on the 3rd floor of the Liang building. She spoke from the dais, her silver coiffure showing her maturity. She was so dignified, her modulating voice speaking of the accomplishments and contributions of the Chinese experience to build this country. Paraphrasing her speech, she said, "Early Chinese immigrants helped explore the richness of this land through mining, fishing, farming, whose unstinted labor contributed to the early completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese Americans in every field of endeavor," end quote. The elderly citizens of Chinatown, the remaining laundrymen who lived upstairs in the Liang building, may not have understood a word that she spoke, but they appreciated the significance of witnessing a possible future First Lady's visit and how the recognition meant acknowledgement of their life's work in their adopted country. I'd like to end with these, my father's words. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so sincerely, Shirley and Lena, for sharing these rich and remarkable insights into UNE and his beloved community. It's now my honor to introduce Jacqueline Wu to the podium. I remember so fondly working with Jackie while she was a CMU undergraduate here at the Detry Library and Archives. I want to give a little bit of background on her. So Jacqueline Wu is a PhD student at Yale University studying race and migration in the United States. She received a BA in history and a BS in business administration from Carnegie Mellon University, where her senior thesis on Chinese labor in the Northeastern US won the Dietrich Humanities Prize, the Pennsylvania Historical Association's William A. Pencack Award, and most recently, the American Historical Association's Raymond J. Cunningham Prize. She is currently working on research projects centered on Chinatowns and the politics of Chinese exclusion. Welcome, Jackie.
What?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sierra, and thank you to everyone for coming today. As Sierra mentioned, I came to college here in Pittsburgh, and my exploration of my own identity as a daughter of Chinese immigrants and my growing interest in historical research and writing came together at the same time as the tail end of the long efforts to commemorate Chinatown with a marker, which was unveiled the spring of my senior year. I became interested in looking for the stories of Chinese experiences here in Western Pennsylvania and other places without existing Chinatown neighborhoods today, having grown up in Central and later Southeastern Pennsylvania. And just for clarification, I use the term Chinese in this presentation to refer to Pittsburgh residents of Chinese descent, both Chinese immigrants and their children, regardless of their citizenship or legal status. So I will jump right in to my first story and then weave that into the larger context of Chinese experiences in the region. So this is a map of every Chinese-owned laundry listed in the Pittsburgh City Directory in 1916, 41 of them. I actually put this together last night, mapping every address listed in there, because I think it really helps us to visualize how expansive Chinese life was across the city, where people worked and often lived. And even this is an undercount of what the Chinese laundries actually were. Laundry work, as we saw in Yanni's story, was one of often the only available opportunities given employment discrimination in other sectors. And laundry work's relatively low barrier to entry became a highly visible way that Chinese people inhabited space throughout the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh outside downtown. Especially interestingly, recent research has suggested that salaries of laundry workers were actually better than that of many immigrant mill workers, at times exceedingly so. While some of these exact locations on the map here are perhaps a few yards off because some of the streets have shortened, it shows that for a significant number of Chinese people, perhaps a few who worked at each of these laundries, day-to-day life took place outside the nexus of Chinatown, even before the main construction of the Boulevard of the Allies that cut through the neighborhood. And so this is all of the Chinatown laundries or Chinese laundries in 1931, and then taking away the ones from 1916, you can see how that changed there. Some of these markers overlap a little bit, so it's hard to see, but there are 127 in total of them here. Other research in this time period has put this number actually closer to 160, a number that might be so high in part because of the boulevard construction that made people look to work and live elsewhere. Although technologically threatened by the advent of steam laundry, which required much more initial investment in machinery, but lower cost of operation later on, there were still a few Chinese-owned laundries in the city all the way through the 1980s. So this is an example of one of these Chinese laundries located at 512 Court Place in 1939. And a much shortened Court Place exists today on kind of the other side of the same block that the Chinatown Inn restaurant is on. And I think the history of laundry work is a fantastic place to root a history of the Chinese experience, because it is a type of labor not only impacted by external factors like employment discrimination, but has also been a site of community organizing and assertions of the right to stay and thrive in cities like Pittsburgh. Around the turn of the century, local Chinese considered organizing a trust called the Chinese Home Finished Laundry Company to employ more jobless Chinese residents as delivery workers to compete with the white-owned steam laundries that were starting to to pop up. Chinese entrepreneurs also resisted threats from local media, unions, and white laborers through the early 20th century by appealing to government representatives, local churches, and the local Chamber of Commerce to assert their right to be here. So my main objective here today is ultimately to expand on the histories that we know of Chinese residents in Western Pennsylvania, and to join with my incredible fellow panelists in sharing the ways that Chinese people from the 19th century through the present day have built their lives, created communities, and left inspirational legacies. And so I know we've already touched on this topic a little bit, so I will just provide a little bit of context about the several hundred Chinese workers that were brought to the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company in 1872. As you can see, this is the marker that was referenced. It was unveiled in October 2021. And some of the rationale for bringing these Chinese workers in was that they were cheaper workers, that they would help to break strikes among the white workers who were already employed there. And so while this story is one characterized by anti-Chinese rhetoric and violence, whether from the white workers who saw the Chinese as an economic threat or from the employers who based their employment on stereotypes about Chinese people being cheap and docile, it is clear that the Chinese people in Beaver Falls 150 years ago also had their own objectives, hopes, desires, and lives. Many were in the United States to earn money for families back home, who they hoped to one day rejoin. Others sought to build their lives here in the United States, leaving Beaver Falls for cities like Pittsburgh, where they became some of the first Chinatown residents. However, although the story can be seen as a time of greater Chinese labor mobility than the years following the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, there were still already many anti-Chinese laws and policies like the ones that Lena mentioned in her talk, that also continued well into the 20th century. And so this is a political cartoon by Thomas Nass, and it's sort of depicting the sort of gatekeeping aspect of Chinese exclusion. So some of the acts that preceded the 1882 Exclusion Act included the 1875 Page Act, which was seemingly neutral in its language, banning unfree laborers and women for immoral purposes, but was effectively wielded to ban Chinese women from immigrating due to the accusation that Chinese women were prostitutes. Other laws and policies banning non-citizens from mining, owning land, and more kept Chinese immigrants from more diverse employment opportunities, since the 1790 Naturalization Act reserved naturalized citizenship for whites only. Laws in states like Pennsylvania kept non-citizens from becoming certified in trades like undertaking and plumbing well into the 20th century. The 1892 Aguirre Act then extended the 1882 Exclusion Act and added requirements for certificates of residence, and continued to complicate life for Western Pennsylvania's Chinese. This brought the bureaucracy of the U.S. Immigration Service into everyday lives and perpetuated the idea that Chinese were not welcome or qualified members of society. And it wasn't until 1943 in the Magnuson Act that Chinese were then eligible for naturalized citizenship. I now want to slip in, however, an unexpected story that I encountered yesterday in this fantastic new book on sports, race, and memory in Pittsburgh by Professor Robert T. Hayashi. So this is a very recent addition to what I was planning to say. It's called Fields of Play, and it's about sports, race, memory, sports, race, and memory in the Steel City. So I was really interested to see that he actually does talk about Pittsburgh's Chinatown in this book, which literally came out in the last couple of months. And I just wanted to read a little bit about this particular story of Chinese baseball players from Hawaii who toured in the 1910s. The all-Chinese team was backed by prominent Chinese Hawaiians and local business leaders. And then so that's sort of the context, and they were actually scheduled to play against the University of Pittsburgh's team on June 12th in 1911 at the Pirates' lavish New Park Forbes Field. That unfortunately got canceled, but the following year, the Chinese team was back in town, staying at the 7th Avenue Hotel, their status as elite student athletes and Chinese Hawaiians allowing them unique mobility for non-white players. Next up was local Washington and Jefferson College. The Chinese won 14-3, and a few days later outclassed Allegheny College after the Celestials suffered an onslaught upon Grove City College. In early September, they were back in town again, and you see the story of how they came and played sports in Pittsburgh in a time that most people wouldn't have imagined that happening. So it's fascinating to think about this Chinese involvement in high-profile sports games in Pittsburgh, a city for which sports is and has always been central. And the way that newspapers thought about this, racialized and other baseball team, while also consuming their games as entertainment and admiring their gameplay. To be quite honest, I just got this book yesterday, but I'm ready knowing that I would recommend it to a lot of people interested in these themes. It's a fantastic snapshot of the questions that academic studies of race and place are asking today. And to conclude, I want to acknowledge that the institutional support of these histories and the academic structures that enable me and other scholars to engage with stories of historical Chinatowns, Asian American history, and ethnic studies more broadly would not exist without the coalitions and solidarities of African American, Asian, Indigenous, and Latino students, activists, and organizers, some of whom we're seeing here and on this next slide, who push for greater attention to these stories and for institutions to use their resources to continue developing and amplifying the histories that marginalized communities had already been preserving and stewarding for generations. As I want to briefly outline in my final point, these movements and the foundation of Chinese American history were internationalist from the start and concerned with not only strictly Chinese American issues or Asian American coalition building, but freedom struggles and struggles for liberation abroad as well. No history, no self. No history, no self. So they sound the same, but you really have to look at it to get it. This quote, translated from Filipino intellectual and political activist Jose Rizal, it's the root of why I do history and how history is empowering and entangled with self-identity and the present moment at large. Rizal recovered histories of the Philippines and its culture and identity before colonization, to help define what it would mean for the Philippines to be its own nation and for people to become Filipinos, defines a national identity outside of Spanish colonization that had taken place for over 300 years. Though advocating for peaceful reform of the oppressive colonial rule of the Philippines, he was still executed by the Spanish colonial government in 1896 for rebellion, sedition, and conspiracy. His fate, despite being relatively moderate, contributed to the struggle for independence from Spain and later from the American imperial power that moved in and prevented true independence until 1946. So just drawing from his quote, I believe that knowing about the stories of people like the residents of Pittsburgh's Chinese communities who cared for each other, who helped each other navigate hardship, and who made up part of the fabric of Pittsburgh from the 19th century through the present day is empowering for not only Chinese Americans, but everyone. Lastly, the Asian American activist tradition of protest, solidarity, and radical empathy is one that should continue to inspire us all, a call that is truly centered in the idea that power belongs to people and their communities, who have the right to shape their own lives, to challenge injustice, and to build thriving societies free from discrimination and oppression. As we've seen in the last Mayor of Chinatown film, and we'll see shortly in the next one as well, this spirit has always been here in Pittsburgh, where Chinese people and African Americans and members of so many other immigrant and ethnic groups built communities to support each other, despite social and political and legal challenges to their ability to live and work in certain places. The spirit of activism that made these academic histories possible has manifested through the 20th century and especially into the present day, where it lives on in all of us and calls us to challenge and subvert existing power structures to believe in and take care of people and communities. Thank you. And it is now my honor to introduce Lydia Y. Ott, who is a recent graduate from the University of Pittsburgh studying occupational therapy. She is a fourth-generation Chinese American whose family has lived in Pittsburgh for over 100 years. She grew up in the Wexford area and now currently resides in Squirrel Hill. In her free time, Lydia actively participates in her local church, Pittsburgh Chinese Church, located in the North Hills.
Hello. It is so great to see so many people in the community showing up. Really, these events are not possible unless people in the community care and keep coming and keep telling these stories. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jackie. And I learned so much from all of you guys who have gone before me in your talks. So like Jackie said, I am a native Pittsburgher. My family has been in the Pittsburgh area for over 100 years. And so I would have dinner with my grandma every week, and she would tell me all of these stories about what it was like to grow up in Chinatown. And so for me, it was a very normal, everyday, weekly routine. We would go to my grandma's house, she'd tell us a story, I'd learn something new, and I would go home. But it wasn't until I started graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, right in the middle of 2020, when the rise of Asian hate crimes just really skyrocketed all across America. And it really made me think about what it means to be a Pittsburgher, what it means to be an Asian American female, what it means and what I am to do as part of this community. And so, as I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I had the opportunity actually to talk with the Dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. And he was asking us if we felt safe on campus, if there was any concerns, if there was anything that he could do to make us feel more at home and more safe. And I was in this Zoom meeting, of course, because it's COVID. And there were about 4 other Asian American females in the call with me, all of whom had not grown up in Pittsburgh, who were not familiar with Pennsylvania. And they started ripping on Pittsburgh, and it made me very mad. They started saying things like, you know, Pittsburgh doesn't have any diversity. We don't have any H marts here. I can't find the groceries I want. And I was very quiet for 45 minutes. And I really thought about, should I say something? Should I not? And I ended up unmuting, the scariest part on Zoom, unmuting and just saying, okay, well, did you know that Pittsburgh actually used to have a Chinatown? And everyone was like, what? No, I didn't know that. And so I started to tell them the stories that I'd heard around the dinner table so many times, and just telling them the story of Pittsburgh's Chinatown, my grandma's experience in Chinatown. And after the meeting was over, the dean of the College of Diversity came up to me and said, you know, Lydia, I think that's great. I think what you're doing is great. Let's get connected and let's start your project. And I was really confused because I was in school for occupational therapy, which is in the health and rehab science school. And so I just repeated, I was like, my project is finishing grad school. I would like to become an occupational therapist. And he was like, no, don't worry. I'll connect you with my secretary. We'll get in touch and I'll get you funding for your whole project. And I was like, okay, if we're talking about funding, I'm more than happy to talk to your secretary. So we ended up connecting and we made this whole project. You guys are going to see the film very, very soon, and you'll meet the dean of the College of Medicine. But really, this story, we've heard so many stories from people who have lived in Chinatown, but this is personally my family's story, my grandma's story of her experience in Chinatown, and you'll hear a little bit from her after we show the video.
In the recent attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Lydia Ott, one of our graduate students. The recent attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Lydia Ott, one of our graduate students in occupational therapy, shared with us her family story.
She is a Pittsburgh native, as were her parents, as were her grandparents, and as a matter of fact, her grandmother grew up in what was Pittsburgh's Chinatown.
It gave us the ability to tell a story that really a lot of people had no idea ever existed.
Appreciating the diversity and the complexity of our society in Pittsburgh is very critical to not only be inclusive, but really celebrate the full fabric of the city, full fabric of our university, and give that vision to the next generation.
When you are interacting with a patient, you need to know the context from which their lives come, because that is important as you try to treat them.
If you don't understand where people live and how they live, I think it's difficult to provide comprehensive care.
I think it's important for us to know each other. What I always say is that we can't hate each other close up.
It makes a huge difference, I think, if people know that they are appreciated where they learn and where they work.
Your story is important. Your culture is important to us. We want to hear about it. We want to share it. We want to celebrate it with you. And that's what makes Pitt and Pittsburgh such a rich environment.
Hi, my name is Lydia Ott. I am in my second year of the doctorate program of occupational therapy at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a fourth generation Pittsburgher. Pittsburgh is home. Pitt is home, and in the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans, I think it's really important that we know the history of our city. People don't know that there was ever a Chinatown in Pittsburgh, and it's really important to me because my grandma grew up there.
My name is Lydia Lee Ott. I grew up in Chinatown in Pittsburgh at 510 3rd Avenue, and I lived there until I got married and graduated from Pitt in nursing. 510 3rd Avenue. In this place used to be the building where I and the rest of my siblings were born. Chinatown, at the time when I was growing up, was just one block downtown. 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, bounded by Grand Street and Ross Street, and that was Chinatown. So it's small space, but there's a lot of people. On Sundays, there would be people, like the laundries would close, and then they would have to come to Chinatown to buy things or just to socialize. So then the streets would be crowded. At that time, there were a lot of stores around the block, and there were some restaurants. Chinese at that time did laundry work and restaurant work because there was discrimination, and they would open their own business because nobody would hire them. They did what they could. And San Kuang Yin, the store where my father was now the owner, was on 3rd Avenue, right across from Grand Street. And it was a general merchandise store. And it sold things that Chinese would use that you would not find in a supermarket at that time. Our family did everything. So we were able to because there were a lot of children and everybody pitched in to do the work.
It was really necessary in the 1900s for people to have a place to go where they could have a job, where they could live, where they could feel supported and have people who spoke their language. It's not only the story of my family and the story of generations of Chinese Americans living in the city, but it's a story of Pittsburgh.
Now this is where the Providence Mission was, where we had the Sunday school. Mrs. Shaw and her daughter Mabel Velsky, not only did they teach us about God, but they taught the older people, like my parents and that generation. They helped them to learn English. Mabel acted as a social worker because my parents did not know how things worked here. After we moved out of the 2nd Avenue Providence Mission, the Salvation Army building was here on this block. We could meet in there and have our Sunday school classes in there. Chinatown Inn is the restaurant that is on 3rd Avenue, and that's what you will see if you go to 3rd Avenue in downtown. They still have the, like the pagoda roof.
Really, Chinatown Inn is the last visual piece left in Pittsburgh of what Chinatown used to be.
In 1920, after the Boulevard of the Allies was built, it cut Chinatown in half. Prior to the building of the Boulevard of the Allies, there were maybe blocks and blocks, maybe 4 or 5 blocks all around that had Chinese in it. And so when I was growing up, it was just now reduced to 1 block.
Would you say that the Boulevard of the Allies killed Chinatown?
It certainly divided Chinatown and made people want to move away. So today, if you go to Chinatown, you will not see a whole lot of stores.
And it is sad to know that Chinatown in Pittsburgh is gone, but in a way, even though it is gone, it's not forgotten. Chinatown is important to everyone because it's part of Pittsburgh's history. It's part of who Pittsburgh is as a city, and it's really important for me as an Asian American to keep telling the story.
Chinatown for me has wonderful memories because in my 89 years, I have seen a lot of change. Lots of Chinese people are still living in Pittsburgh today, and thankfully, they are not confined to the block, 3rd Avenue, 2nd Avenue, Grant, and Ross Street. You know, the people that made up Chinatown are no longer here. I guess I'm hoping that the values and traditions that were practiced in Chinatown will be carried on, but that may not be happening. But in a way, traditions are carried on, but in a little different form.
And even though Chinatown is gone, there are parts of Chinatown that live on in different parts of the city. Various regions of our city have just the essence of Chinatown, the community, the stores, the culture, and the language. If you look around in Pittsburgh, it's here.
I'm thinking, you know, in a lot of other cities, there is still a Chinatown. I think there was a need for Chinatown, a physical place where Chinese would feel at home. But that is not necessary now.
Even though in Pittsburgh we don't have that Chinatown, I think we still really need that space to be seen and heard and to grow as a community, not just as Chinese people, but as Chinese Americans, as Asian Americans, balancing both parts of our culture of being Asian, but also being American. It's really important as we train here at the University of Pittsburgh to be the best practitioner that we can be, to see the people in our city that aren't being seen. We need to be equipped as practitioners to be able to deal with that and to treat them with the needs that they have presented. The OCA, the Organization of Chinese Americans, put on a free clinic for Chinese Americans to receive healthcare services from other Asian Americans. I think this was really helpful to the Chinese population in particular because 1, it was free, and 2, it was important for people in our community to be able to be treated by people who look like them, who can speak their language. It was also great to help serve the underserved population of people who might not have healthcare services. And so it was just a way for us to help bridge that gap. It was really special to be part of the OCA clinic. It brought our city together. It brought people from all different walks of life to work together for a common goal to help Chinese Americans get the healthcare and the services that they need. We have really diverse populations here that need to be treated, that need to be seen, that have their voices heard. That makes Pittsburgh what it is. That makes Pittsburgh really special, that we are a community and a city of different people, different languages, different things, but that we all are still working together to make Pittsburgh as great as it can be. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing you to my grandma. Lydia Lee Ott is a nonagenarian blessed with posterity, which includes 4 great-grandchildren and one which is in the back. She earned a BSN from the University of Pittsburgh. She currently works part-time in her son's dental office. She enjoys gardening, sewing, and serving in church, especially with children. And this video was made last year, so it said she was 89, but she is now 90 as of this year.
That might.
Thank you very much for that introduction. As a 90-year-old, and there is a value in Chinese tradition that you respect the elderly. And I have permission from Sierra at this time, since you have all been so patient sitting, you have the opportunity to stand up for 1 minute and stretch. So we want to stretch.
Oh, that's it. No, don't violate that.
In Chinatown, where I lived until I married and moved away. When my grandfather died, my father had to leave elementary school to help support the family. And he did whatever he could do, which included selling brushes, going from door to door. In time, a relative in California sponsored him to come to the United States. And he worked hard so he could repay the passage that it cost for him to come here. And after he earned enough money for that, then he had to earn more in order to go back to China, to marry, have a son, and then come back to the US to work some more, to earn money, to bring my mom and my oldest brother to the United States. And so the next, oh, sorry.
No, you're good, you're good.
So my father, and these are 4 of the 8 children that would complete our family. The oldest brother was born in China, and the next 7, well, we continued to grow. And this was 1937. And then as we grew, a family of 8 children, and my mom and dad, which made 10, and we lived in 1 room, and there was 1 small bedroom down the hallway. This 1 room was our dining room, living room, kitchen, and bedroom. And there was 1 bathroom. And so we were under the poverty line, but we didn't know it. It didn't matter because everyone around the block were in the same situation. The business was downstairs and the family lived upstairs. Okay. We kept the Chinese tradition, and this was the Chinese New Year. And you see that my father is giving us red packets with money in it. And another tradition that we had was going to Homewood Cemetery. And that was mentioned before by one of the other speakers. And then going to the cemetery in the spring, we would take food. There would be like duck, rice, wine, and also incense and paper money. And so we honored our ancestors in that way. We took the food home and ate it. And the paper, money, and the incense we burned. There was a special little house that was built in Homewood Cemetery for the people to burn the papers that they bought, which was their way of sending it to the ancestors. This picture is taken in our living room, and there are 7 of us here. On the right, the first one, Edwin, was now in college in engineering. And then Lydia, that's me, was studying nursing. And then next to me was Rosie, and she was studying education. Education was very important to our parents. We did our study, we did our homework, and then we worked in the store. San Hong Yan was remodeled. You have seen pictures of the previous Chinatown, which did not look anything like this. And in front of the old buildings, there was usually a bench where people could sit. So if you go inside the store of San Hong Yan, which we get my father, who came to Pittsburgh because a relative sponsored him to come here. He started to work in San Hong Yan, and then he moved on to become a partner, and later became the owner of San Hong Yan. If you look at the corner of the business card that he had, you can tell that it was very old. On the upper left, you see the phone number. There was no area code. You look on the lower right, no zip code. So this was my father's business card in a store of San Hong Yan. If you go inside the store, you would see my father and my mother behind the counter. And this is the remodeled counter. The old counter that they worked from for years was like the one on the upper left. And so in the store, we sold things, as was mentioned before, because the Chinese, due to discrimination, could not be hired. Not because they were not qualified, but because you are Chinese, we cannot hire you. So they did what they could. They opened their own restaurants and they ran their own laundries. And we sold supplies. And this would be for the restaurant. This would be the scoop. And they would scoop out your chop suey with this, we called it the hall. And also, the upper one is like a spatula. You can move all of your bean sprouts with a soy sauce on it around the wall with this spatula. And so the other things that we sold in the store, and over on the side later, if you want to, you can see some of the things that were sold in the store. Some of them are actually original, and some are them like facsimiles. Okay. On the upper left was a weight scale. And since my father, when he was still out on the West Coast and working, he worked in a laundry, he worked in a general store, and he also had the opportunity to be an apprentice in a herbal pharmacy. And so if you came to San Hong Yan and you had a cold or a sore throat or a fever, he would go to his stall and give you some berries maybe some leaves, or maybe some roots, whatever he thought you needed. And he would wrap it and fold the paper up in an envelope and wish that you would be cured from whatever your problem was. These were some of the medicines that we sold. And you're probably all familiar with the tiger balm. And inside, the one on the tall case in the box were little red pills. And if you read it, it would cure almost everything that you had. I remember a time when I needed to take medicine and it was bitter. My father would hold my nose, so I would open my mouth and then they would put the medicine in. Unfortunately, they did not know about Mary Poppins, who said a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. So, okay, shark's fin is one of the things that is on display in one of the cases over there. And this was something used for a very special occasion because it was very expensive. And a lot of our goods at that time were shipped from China. And some of the things that were shipped from China came in wooden crates and the box would be lined. And I remember when we received a crate of freshwater chestnuts from China, the box wooden crate would be lined with a straw mat. And then along with the water chestnuts would come these giant roaches. Oh. And so my brothers sometimes would catch them and they would pull the legs off the one side and then they watched the roaches walk around and they laughed. My mom was recycling before it was the trend to do so. We got rice in 100-pound sacks. And when the rice was all sold, my mom would take this wonderful heavy material. And one thing was, you would make an apron out of it. Very practical, and it lasts for a long time. As a matter of fact, I have an apron in my house now made from one of these rice sacks. And the other thing was, these rice sacks, we put them on the floor. And when you came in, that was the floor mat. You can wipe your feet because the fabric was very dense and very strong. So that was a floor mat. We also sold what we eat from, bowls and chopsticks and spoons. These bowls, if you can read the Chinese, will celebrate the 65th anniversary of my parents. As was said before, the store was not just a store to buy stuff. It was also a social center because on Sunday, when the laundries closed, the people would come to Chinatown and they would find out what the news is and they would solve the world's problems. And in addition to the buying of the grocery, there was also, shall we say, recreation in a form of games of chance. There was a lottery and it had 80 characters on it. And you made a bid, you bought a chance. And of the 80 characters, 20 would be punched out. And depending on how many you picked, which matched with the 20 that were punched out, you would get the money for that. I guess it was kind of like a keno that you would get in a gambling place today. They also played something called Pai Gil, and that was mentioned before too. And this was like dominoes, only they were flat and they were rectangular. And they had holes in the block, red and white. And that was also recreation for them. Okay? And the women would often have the opportunity to go upstairs and visit with my mom. There was always a cup of tea ready for you, a teapot, and that was shown also in one of the videos before. And in addition to having the tea for the customers in the store, on Sundays, my mom would make dinner for the customers that were in the store. And so you wondered about education. Our parents were very interested and wanted so much for us to know about the Chinese culture and traditions. And this is one of the books on the upper left, and you would open it from the left to the right. When you open that book, you would see that the characters are written vertically. So as you read it, your head would go up and down because you had to do that in order to read. And this was one of my textbooks. And so the older children who first in the family to go to school would sometimes have problem in school because at home they only spoke Chinese. And Bill, my husband, when he first went to school, he flunked first grade just because he did not know the language. But thankfully, as the years went on, he progressed and then he graduated as a valedictorian in high school. Getting on with our English education, and it really exposed us to a wider world. In Chinatown, it was so homogeneous. You know, we spoke the same language, we ate the same kind of food, we had the same socioeconomic status. But when we went to school, then we had interactions, you know, with Afro-Americans, with Jewish, with those of European descent, and it just opened up our world much wider. So this is Fifth Avenue High School, and you see in the students that were here, 2 Chinese, some Afro-Americans, Jewish, those of European ascent. And most of us did pretty well academically in high school. I remember in the morning, in our homeroom, we would stand up, put our hand over our heart, and we would say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then somebody read from the Bible, and then we would go to our classes. And school was not always study. In this picture, you see some of the extracurricular activity. Fifth Avenue High School had a football team that included 2 boys, Alvin Lee and Jackie Yee from Chinatown. And so I was a cheerleader at that time. And I remember one cheer that we had, which was intended for our opposition. And it went something like this: go back, go back, go back to the woods. You haven't You haven't got the goods. You haven't got the rhythm. You haven't got the jazz. You haven't got the team Fifth Avenue has. Extracurricular activity. And that was part of our English education. You know, our academic education prepared us for achieving the American dream. Go to a good school, get a good job, buy a house, get married, have a family, retire for 70, 80, 90 more years. But what happens then? Mrs. Shaw and Mabel taught us about God's love. And this was on the 2nd Avenue side of this block. And they, in this space called Providence Mission, would come down every Sunday from 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock to teach us about God's love, about hope, about peace, about faith. And not only did they teach us on Sunday, but they lived it during the week. When there was a problem, they saw that many of the adults did not know Chinese, and they taught them Chinese. And not only that, but they were cognizant of what the problems were in the current age where they lived, where we were growing up. And one of them was prohibition. They felt it was not good that people should be drinking so much, because this was depression and money should be spent for other things. And so in addition to teaching us, Jesus loves me, this I know, they also, I remember Mrs. Rodenbaum, and she said, you know what booze is, and she taught us also, down with the booze, down with the booze. We want groceries and we want shoes. That was very practical, you know, not just speaking about spiritual things, but what are the problems of the time? We should address those too. And so we appreciated that. My mom is in this picture, and also Shirley's grandmother is in this picture from way back. Out of this group of the Chinese kids around the block, and there were like 22 children that lived on this block. So we really had a good time just within our block. Played together, went to school together, and just loved and supported one another. In the picture that you see here, you will see 2 of the future football players and 2 of the cheerleaders. And Shirley's aunt, Anna, was one of the cheerleaders, and I was one of the others. The loving teachers that came to teach us about God practiced what they taught. They not only taught us, but they invited us to their home. And this is a picture of one of the homes that we went to. What a different experience. Instead of seeing cement sidewalks, we saw grass. Instead of telephone poles, we saw trees. We went into their house. There was space. There was carpet on the floor. And I had my first taste of potato salad in their homes. This picture was taken about 1943. World War II was happening at that time. And we had opportunity as children to support the Allies. At that time, China and the United States were on the same side. They were the Allies. And we did our part to raise money to help the war effort. And there's a picture, and this includes showing Aunt Ruth, Aunt Anna, and me at one event to raise money. Some of the young men were in the military, but as children, we could be junior commandos. And you see that the corporal stripes, 2 stripes, were put on Clara's arm. And one of our jobs to help the war effort as junior commandos was to collect newspapers. Chinatown is growing. After the war, it was mentioned before that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. And so after the war, they were able to go to China to marry and to come back here and raise a family. And you see a new generation here, but they did not settle in Chinatown. They went to North Side, South Side, Oakland, wherever, which accounts for one reason why the population in Chinatown was decreasing. This is another reason why the people in Chinatown were decreasing. I told you that my father came and his purpose was to earn money. And after 40-some years in Pittsburgh, his children all grown up, and most of them on the West Coast, they decided that they would go there and be with them. So that's another reason why the population in Chinatown decreased. Thank you very much for listening. For all the other historical details, Jackie and Lena have filled you in on that. But this was just our family's personal experience. Thank you. Sierra will handle the question and answering time.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for passing over the mic so graciously. And I just ask you not to sell yourself short in any way. It is such an honor for all of us to hear from you and your firsthand memories of Pittsburgh's Chinatown. At this point, I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage. We are going to field just a couple questions from our audience here, as well as our audience online. And then from there, we can transfer the conversation to more informal settings. So if I could have all of our panelists come up, thank you. All right. So what we'll do is we'll open with a question from our virtual audience, but those of you who are in person, if you could start thinking on any particular questions that you have. So the first question is actually fairly specific, and it is for Shirley. So someone from our virtual audience asked, did Mary Yi write his memories in Chinese or English after his stroke?
My father? No, he wrote it all in English.
Yes. And the remarkable thing to emphasize that I know Lena brought up is the fact that after having a debilitating stroke, he taught himself how to write with his left hand, right?
That's right, because before his stroke, he was right-handed, but so he could no longer use his right hand very well. So he taught himself to use his left hand to write, and he wrote stories in all caps on notebook paper, and I saved them all.
Thank you so much, Shirley. We really appreciate that. And then could we take a question from our virtual or from our audience here in person? Yeah, I see yours first. Yeah. If you...
I was wondering when your father ran for council, like how that election went and like how close he was to winning and like what response was for running.
And Shirley, if that's okay, I just want to repeat the question for our virtual audience. So an audience member was wondering, Mary, or informally, Mary Yi and his run for city council in 1973, how did the race actually go? How close was he? Was he a competitive candidate?
Well, in 1973, there was 5 city council seats open, and he was one of 46 candidates who ran for those 5 seats, and he came in 11th. And that was pretty good. So
excellent. Okay, so our second question that came in from our virtual audience is what are some of the historic, and I guess this would probably be more for Shirley and for Lydia, but anyone else is willing to chime in, is more than welcome to chime in. What are some of the interactions, particularly historical, but also current, between the Pittsburgh Chinese community and then other minority communities as well? Thinking about that historically, but also contemporarily.
A lot of interaction in high school, and because of my father attending 5th Avenue High School, and lots of interaction with kinds of people at that time.
Great, thank you.
I can jump in.
Please, absolutely, Jackie.
Yeah, if you think about like the spatial arrangement of where Chinese businesses and laundries were throughout the city, they were inherently, working amongst other ethnic groups. They had customers from other ethnic groups, so that was a form of interaction. Another interesting fact, which I found out when I was looking at like the state laws prohibiting like Chinese people from becoming undertakers or plumbers or electricians for a while, because many of them were not legal citizens yet, is that a lot of the Chinese community had to go to like funeral homes run by white undertakers because they could not be undertakers. So that's another interaction that they had. And then I just want to point out lastly that the construction of the Boulevard of the Allies not only displaced parts of Chinatown, but also other groups in the Pittsburgh community, including African Americans in the Hill District and other parts. So thinking about those joint histories and how they sort of inform each other is also really important to keep in mind.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts or responses from our panel? Okay, wonderful. So we have another question from our audience in person here. Oh. Go ahead, yeah.
I work at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Ethnic Studies, and a big topic of our research revolves around the kind of growth of all minority communities, otherwise marginalized communities in the Pittsburgh region, but also in America more broadly. And looking at Chinatown, there's going to be two narratives around them. One of a relic of the past, relic of segregation, a relic of a time when migrants had to go to a place that was sectioned off the map. My grandparents came to the Puerto Rican neighborhood because they had to. That was the law at the time. The other narrative you see, however, is Chinatown's as a location of cultural preservation and as a safe space. And I wanted to ask you, and I realize there's a huge intersection here of these two things, and they're not mutually exclusive, whether you view Chinatown as being relevant segregation or as a safe space, cultural celebration and preservation of cultural heritage.
Really interesting question. So what I'll do is summarize again for our virtual audience. So our audience member in person is asking, you know, when we think about Chinatown or other ethnic enclaves where folks live in close proximity to one another geographically, there's the narrative, you know, that like this was a place of cultural preservation, is a safe space for members of those communities. And then there's the other also narrative that's perhaps actually like not necessarily directly conflicting, but is an alternative narrative that is like that there was such discrimination at the time that it was just there's this clear vision of like this is where this community lives, and it's because of kind of a lack of a broader, more welcoming, more inclusive society. So I hope I summarized that effectively, and I'll turn it over to our panel who would ever like to respond.
I can say something as someone who grew up in an ethnic enclave under very different circumstances. I think it really comes down to a matter of choice, right? My parents, you know, when they first immigrated to the States, they immigrated to San Francisco, in part because that's where they already had family and they were so reliant on existing networks of support in a place where they didn't speak the language or have existing, you know, job opportunities. For them, there was an element of choice there that didn't exist perhaps for previous generations. My parents could choose to live in places that weren't, you know, directly San Francisco Chinatown at the time. And when I was growing up in LA, we didn't live in LA Chinatown. We lived in the San Gabriel Valley, which is, you know, a different enclave that some would argue, you know, today there's more Asian immigrants there of many different ethnic backgrounds than there are even in LA Chinatown, right? But the decision to be there was not because we were forced to be there. And for a long time, I have to say, when I was growing up, I resented living in a place that was majority Asian. I felt like it was too much of a bubble for me. And that's why I really wanted to leave. And now that I'm older, I'm 36 now that I have a child of my own, I became a mother two years ago. I'm actually planning to move back to Monterey Park, California, where I grew up in about 6 months. And I think, you know, again, it's because I realize it's important for me to have the opportunity to impart certain cultural practices and traditions and histories to my child. But I am so many generations removed from that history at times that it's very hard for me to do that if not in places where the food is accessible, where you hear the language, where all those things exist. And so there's a kind of, you know, there's a kind of comfort there that I understand today, that I understood only as a child as a form of restriction. And that has really changed for me. And it's part of my own personal evolution, right? And I think something probably very similar can be expressed by many people, including immigrants of my parents' generation, that there are choices today that they now have that they didn't have when they started with, when my ancestors first arrived to this country.
Yeah. And I just want to add into like speaking about choice and how in the early days there maybe wasn't as much of a choice to like live where you actually maybe wanted to, or to venture out to different areas. It's important to underscore the sort of anti-Chinese rhetoric and anti-Chinese sentiment that was stoked throughout the country, not only California. There's also studies of anti-Chinese violence in the Pacific Northwest, throughout the country, really, and thinking about how that shaped people's choices and how it is honestly remarkable that they were able to create these communities and to create these spaces where they could support each other. Yeah,
I'd like to say that to that question, I would say both, because there is such historical value to Chinatowns. And the other Chinatown that's across the state, the Philly Chinatown, is actually being threatened, and they're trying to build a stadium really close to the Philly Chinatown, which is going to really hurt the businesses and the families and the elderly who live in those communities. And so even though maybe we're not, as we shared in our video, that we're not sectioned off into one block, but there are still so many people, there are still so many people who need that community who may not be able to speak English. It's not their first language and they need those services. And I was just in the Philly Chinatown a couple weeks ago and I was walking with a friend and he was telling me his grandma used to live on the 5th floor up in the senior citizens in Chinatown. And so it's just really a space for them now to really just learn, thrive, and grow in America and not be such a fish out of water and learn to adapt and learn to grow. So it does have a historical piece to it, but it's also a place that's still necessary now and is a place, I don't know if you guys, but every time I go to a new city, I always want to see if there's a Chinatown and check it out. So I think they're still relevant and they're still very necessary today.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses and then for everyone's contributions to this program today. We are so very thankful. I wish we could take more questions, but at this juncture of the program, what we'd love to do is transition and make those conversations happen more on an individual level. So after the formal conclusion of the program, all of our guests who are here in person will have an opportunity to take a closer look at some of the cases that have treasured materials from both the Lee and Yi families. Additionally, too, we have items from our Detry Library and Archives that relate to the Chinese community here in Western Pennsylvania, including items from the Moon Yi family. And we want to encourage folks to really dig in and take a look at those materials and to also speak to our panelists. Before we formally conclude, I just have a few thank yous that I'd like to say. Thank you all again to all of our audience, both in person and online, for your remarkable questions and for the insightful answers of our panel. I also want to take a moment and thank my colleagues at the History Center for their role in assisting me with this event. And a special note of thanks I'd like to say to Lydia and Shirley. I remain so moved by the generosity of your time and the care that each of you doled out without measure to share your family stories with the History Center and now with our audience here today. We at the History Center feel so privileged to collaborate with both of you on preserving and sharing these Chinatown memories with our region and beyond. Thank you both so much again. And anyone in our audience, if you have materials relating to the Chinese diaspora in Western Pennsylvania, or really any community in this region, and are interested in sharing these stories, we who are representing the museum and the archives here today, we would love to continue those conversations. So I want to shout out specifically my colleague Matt, who's at the far table to your right, as well as my colleague Carly, and myself here, and of course, Anne, who gave introductory remarks. All of us would be more than happy to speak with you to learn more and just to spend time with you and hear the stories that you'd like to share. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, I also want to invite those of you who are in person to check out our Chinese American display that's in our special collections gallery on the 4th floor. So please do take some time with those materials, all of which were donated by Lydia Ott. And then they will soon be accompanied by the incredible collection UNE, who will be donated by Shirley so graciously and so generously. Let's see, I think I've covered everything. The last thing is, please also consider taking a moment and filling out our survey. We really value feedback for these events and are always eager to learn more about how we can continue to enhance our programs. So behind me, there will be a QR code so you can access the survey and fill it out instantly. But the link to that will also be shared in our chat online and then also distributed via email following this event. Let's see. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful afternoon and we're so excited for the conversations to continue.